Okay, thank you. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Rebecca Slayton. I'm the director of the Judith Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies and an associate professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies and the Gender and Security Sector Lab. I want to start with a brief land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Now, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Muhib Rahman, postdoctoral associate at Cornell University, affiliated with the Department of Government and the Gender and Security Sector Lab. His research intersects international security, civil military relations, and democratic governance. He examines how interstate crisis bargaining and defense cooperation affect government-military conflicts and domestic politics, focusing on elite defection and anti-government armed uprisings. He's also interested in understanding how civil military relations influence states' external threat environment and interstate conflict processes, especially in the global South. He earned his PhD in government from the University of Texas at Austin. So thank you. Looking forward to hearing from you too.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm Muhib Rahman. I'm postdoctoral associate in the government department at Cornell. I'll be presenting my co-authored paper with Nazmul Saqif, who's a Lewis lecturer at the University of Kentucky. So let's begin with the presentation. The topic is military insubordination and international coercion. So the research question we ask in this paper is, how do military insubordination affects a state's ability to prevent foreign aggression? In order to assess this question, we looked at one form of military subordination, which is known as mutiny, and its relations with states' interstate conflict behavior. The key argument is that we argue that military mutiny makes states more vulnerable to international coercion, such as foreign aggression, by disrupting the command structure, more commonly known as military command and control, and more importantly, by revealing critical weaknesses within the state apparatuses to the adversaries. Our empirical results suggest 3 core findings. One is mutinies increase the likelihood that the state is targeted in an interstate conflict. Mutiny also increases the likelihood that the state which is targeted in a conflict is less likely to resist. Finally, more severe mutinies are more likely to have stronger effects. So before going to the details of the argument and the findings, I'd like to offer the outline of the presentation today. So I'll start with the motivating case of Bangladesh mutiny in 2009. Then I'll flesh out primary argument, focusing on the how disruptions in command and control increases the cost of the country's coordinated defense against an external attack. And then I'll talk about why this disruption cannot explain the effects alone, developing sort of a strategic logic that links mutiny with interstate crisis bargaining, what we call informational role of mutiny. So we'll use a very simple formal model to sort of explain the logic of how mutinies act as an informational signal to foreign adversaries. Then we'll talk about hypothesis and the operationalization of variables and statistical findings. Finally, I'll conclude with theoretical and empirical implications. Okay, let's start with the case. So in 2009, there was a mutiny in Bangladesh by BDR. It was formerly known as BDR. It's called Bangladesh Rifles. It is a paramilitary organization within the armed forces, which has the primary task of guarding the border. So in 2009, the organization rebelled against the superior officers in a cultural event, and they killed 56 officers, and including the chief of the BDR, who is from the army. And there were also incidences of sexual violence and injuries of the civilians. So this was a very dramatic event, nothing like in the history of civil military relations in Bangladesh. And it strained the relationship between military and the government, and also within the military significantly. If we look at the drivers of this mutiny, it was basically about grievances. One form of grievances was payroll related, so they were demanding for increased pay scale and also rations and other benefits. There were also inter-agency disputes. The problem of a paramilitary organization under the armed forces is that the superior officers come from the armed forces. They're not from the BDR. So there were objections that those officers coming from another organization sort of subjugate the ones that are within. So there are like long-standing objections of abuses there. So these mutiny created two forms of disruptions in the command structure. One is within the military structure. There were about 35,000 BDS soldiers. So there was a compromised control over those soldiers. And the second thing, there was a strained relations between the government and the armed forces, because they were sort of objecting that the government did not do take adequate initiative to protect those endangered officers who were killed during the event. So what happened? So this was basically the internal picture, right? What is happening within the military and between the government and the military. But we also observed there's a significant repercussions in terms of how it affected the state's external threat environment. Instances of interstate conflict targeting Bangladesh doubled after the military happened. So India initiated a militarized interstate dispute on February 28, just within 3 days of the mutiny. And Myanmar also started another MID, marking only the second time it targeted Bangladesh since the independence. And within the next 3 years, India targeted Bangladesh 3 times and Myanmar again. So what is important here is that these MIDs coming from India is happening while there is a government which is pro-Indian. So even if we had instances of MIDs before, but this doubling, despite there is a pro-Indian government in power, it's kind of puzzling. So I want to check like what's happening here. So this is the list of, MIDs targeting Bangladesh. So this is not a singular case. So this is a work in progress. We're still exploring other cases, but like we found that there are other cases which have similar patterns. For instance, in Peru, mutiny in 1976 by a conservative military general led to border tensions and militarized interstate conflict with Ecuador and Chile. And also like similar things happened in Haiti because of a mutiny. We also see there was following a border conflict with Dominican Republic. So interesting thing, even if there is this pattern of relationship between military insubordination and interstate conflict, we haven't found a single paper to cite that actually deals with this issue. So we started to get the data and see what the like overall picture looks like. And then we started to think about why does military insubordination matter in interstate crisis bargaining? So from the literature, we know that civil military relations influence military operations, right? So it undermines troubled military relations, civil military relations undermines battlefield effectiveness. It also undermines, it also increases the prospect of external intervention, especially through the event of purging. When there is a high level of purging after military insubordination, that reduces military effectiveness and also increases the prospect of external intervention. Mutiny is also weakened. We also know that mutiny from previous literature, that mutiny we can command and control. It challenges states' legitimate monopoly of violence, and also it raises more importantly, raises the cost of war, at least by changing the perceptions of adversaries of its battlefield performances, right? So we argue that mutinies increase the disrupted command and control, increases the cost of war in two ways. First, it undermines group solidarity, kind of psychological bonding within the military, so they're difficult to coordinate for a more efficient operation, military operation. And also, because of that, and also because of the operational inefficiencies caused by these disruptions, there is overall increase in the cost of defense. So now so that's kind of a very intuitive explanation of why military mutiny would lead to increased prospect of external intervention. But then there are some issues that I also saw, like someone also bringing up during the discussion, is how much of a disruption mutinies create, right? So mutinies typically create small-scale disruptions. For instance, more than 60% of mutinies do not involve the use of violence. And about 80% of mutinies have less than 100 soldiers involved, so they're not very large. If we look at the duration, someone also mentioned that about 90% are within the day, right? Within 1 day duration. So if that's the case, can we really explain, by just looking at the magnitude of disruption it creates, that it actually increases the vulnerability, state's vulnerability to external? So then we started to think about some other factors that might involve with the mutiny. So we know how private information relates to war, right? The typical explanation is that if there's a private information, there is a high or increased chance that there is a misunderstanding, miscalculation leading to war, right? But on the other hand, when there is information, asymmetry, and there are some underlying weaknesses which is not exposed to the adversaries, that still allow posturing, right? So you can posture as a strong state if your enemy doesn't know that you have some underlying weaknesses. So if there's no credible way for your enemy to know that you have some issues, then you can still stay strong, right? So we saw that mutiny is kind of a credible signal of state weaknesses that foreign adversaries can observe when there is a mutiny, because it's public and there is a lot of discussion out of it, right? In the media. So I argue that mutiny reveals two sets of critical information. One is they make it public that disruptions we can command and control. So they make it public. There's actually something going on underneath. Because even if there is some disruption in one unit, that doesn't mean that the grievances only is contained with that unit, right? There might be in the similar sort of grievances within other units straining the relationship, but that is not exposed. So it's like tip of the iceberg. So you just know that there are some underlying problems there. And second is the strategic timing. So military as a strategic actor also knows that if they attack the government, that they would invite external intervention, which they also have to pay some cost. Despite knowing that, if they launch the mutiny, that means that generally know that the government is too weak to give some concession that worth more than the cost that they pay. So that eventually make it intuitive that the government is really weak now. So this is the timing is good for an adversary to strike so that the government resolve is low and it's ready to make concessions. And so that's what we call strategic timing and screening effect. So basically what mutiny is doing, it's allowing the foreign adversaries to screen from like strong targets from weak to strong targets, right? So we develop a formal model here. I'll not go to the technical details. I'll just give the very broad overview so that it's easier for everyone to follow. So it's a very simple game of three actors: the government, an intermediate actor, military, and an external actor, an external power, right? It's a partially imperfect or incomplete information game in a sense that military and the government knows what's happening inside, but the external power does not know. What is important is the parameter R. It basically indicates the foregone opportunity that military could leverage given the government weaknesses. So what basically means, if the government is weak, it's the right time for them to push so that they get some concession, right? But if they don't do it, they're losing that sort of opportunity. So the more the weaker the government, the easier for them to push the government and to get the concession, right? So that when R increases, but it creates a trade-off for the military. So the trade-off is the military with an increased R, military is likely to get more concession, but at the cost of increased prospect of external intervention, because it at the same time would communicate increased vulnerability of the government to the adversary. So this is basically the intuition of the model. I'll not go the technical details, just will show you the separating equilibria that we have. So basically, when we have for sufficiently large benefit that military can receive from the government, if that's higher from the cost that they would pay when there is a conflict, we have a separate equilibrium where we see that the military would launch a mutiny when the government is weak. And when external power sees that there's a mutiny, they will exert like external pressure. And when there is an external pressure, if the government is actually weak, it will concede. If it's not weak, it will resist. So that allows us to have the hypothesis here. Which basically means in a state's experience in military, mutinies are more likely to face external aggression, and states experiencing an interstate conflict would be less likely to resist, and more severe, like longer in duration, or like more violent mutinies will have larger effects. So how did we measure external aggression and resistance? So we used a very typical measure, which is known as militarized interstate dispute. It's basically coded by Coordinates of War Project, which means any conflict in which there is a threat or display or usability force short of war by one member of states, which is explicitly directed towards the government. And since we have a broader range of broader scope in terms of looking at the crisis behavior, not just the conflict, we thought that's the better way to measure because that allows some form of bargaining even when there is conflict going on. Focusing on things like war is difficult because that involves most of the time like a larger scale bargaining failure. We have two binary measures. One is whether it's a directed measure, whether the country which is facing the mutiny is targeted. So it only involves those MIDs that the state is the target of, not the initiator of the MID. And it's also directional in a sense that whether that country reciprocated the same way in resisting when they're targeted. So this is a distribution of the mutiny variable. If you see, like it's just the number of directed diet years, where in which a countries faced a mutiny. Look at most. So someone from Afghanistan was talking about relating right to this like. So I think this Afghanistan it has a very high number of instances of military mutiny happening. And interestingly, we know like Pakistan, for instance, is very like troublesome civil military relations, but it has very little instances of civil mutinies is because there is a very cohesive military organization which just kind of suppresses any issues that within the disorder within the military. So measuring military insubordination, I've heard like a lot of questions around this for like how to distinguish between mutiny and coup or defections. I know this is kind of tricky. It's very difficult. Sometimes it's kind of like post hoc rationalizations of whether it was mutiny or like coup. But the basic differences that we try to like code is, so it's not our data, it's from Johnson's data, just and data on mutiny. Basically what they code is, if there is a collective act of insubordination in which troops revolted against lawfully constituted authority, but the important part is, but they do not seek political power. So that distinguishes them from coup. Their main ultimate objective of that revolt is not replacing the government or like taking over power. There's still some like blurry lines, but that's the best that can be done given like in overlaps between these very close conceptual categories, right? We have three additional variables coded: violent, if it involves any use of violence during the event. We have large mutiny, which is if it is more than it involves more than 100 soldiers, and we have duration variable that sort of looks at the number of days the mutiny lasts. So you have both target country controls and also dyadic controls. So we basically control for military spending, military personnel, coup, conscription, and civil conflict, which we found strongly related to the instances of mutiny and interstate conflict. And then we had some dyadic level variables: capability ratio, target defense alliance, challengers defense alliance, alliance interaction score, whether both countries are democracy, and like the minimal distance between those two countries. So we have cross-section time series data for the period 1945 to 2010. We use a directed dyadic sample because of the way dependent variables are measured, like directional from one way to other. And we estimate logic regression models as the baseline estimation, but we also have robustness checks using two-way fixed effects model, which kind of approximate the idea, difference in differences models. And also we have selection models for the resistance variable, because resistance depends on the initiation first. So that's why you have to use a selection model for that. Right. So this is our main finding, baseline findings. If you look at the table, mutiny for all logic and other models is consistently positive and significant, meaning that mutiny basically increases the likelihood that the country is targeted in an interstate conflict. And the findings are basically robust across many different models that we run. So we also did, in order to look at whether mutiny is there's some form of endogeneity or some form of issues like anticipatory things, like if the country, if the external power is expecting some problem in the country, maybe that kind of triggering the effect, right? In order to deal with those sort of possibilities, we added a mutiny lag and leads, and we found that in this two-way fixed effect model, these leads and lags are not significant, meaning that they can reasonably associate the relationship between mutiny and interstate conflict. We also run this heterogeneous effects model, where we show that violent mutiny and large mutiny all are more have stronger effects, given that they are basically creates more disruptions within the command structures, and also are more visible in terms of getting attention from the external power, right? For the target resistance, we have similar. We also have strong support to our hypothesis. We found that military mutiny and the violent ones, the more severe ones, have a larger effect on the likelihood of target state not persisting against an MID. So just to visually show the predicted probability, so that it makes it clear that we found stronger effects for large and more severe mutinies. So if you look at the effects, generally the effect is smaller. But when we only plot for the violent mutiny and large mutiny, the effect is much larger compared to the baseline model. Now, we also have some evidence of effects increasing as the duration increases. Similar cases for the resistance for large and violent mutiny, we see much stronger negative effect in target resistance. But we did not find a really significant relationship between duration and target resistance. So our explanation is that maybe when there is a long-lasting mutiny, states have more time to coordinate and to get control over its force. So we see with in the mutiny with longer duration, we don't see that effect happen in resistance. So, so key theoretical contributions is that civil-military relations affect a state's interstate conflict behavior, environment, threat environment. So we show an additional mechanism through which domestic conflict escalates into interstate conflict. And we also offer an alternative explanation of how private information relates to interstate conflict, right? So in our case, is the revelation of private information increases the likelihood states gets involved into interstate conflict, not its presence, but the revelation of private information. And we show that private mutiny can serve as a credible signal in signaling states' intention to foreign adversaries, right? We also found novel empirical evidence using new mutiny data. Finally, our policy implication is that strengthening military relations, strengthening military command structure is critical for deterrence. And managing superiority grievances can mitigate vulnerability to external coercion. So thank you so much for listening.